Good afternoon, and welcome to TV News Check's News Tech Forum. I'm Michael Depp, the editor of TV News Check, and I'm very happy to lead us into day 3 of our event with a pointed focus on technology today. If you've missed either of our first 2 days of programming, don't fret. We've got complete coverage of all our sessions, included recording video up at tvnewscheck.com. We've already had smart, terrific panels on pivoting the newsroom to crisis, novel approaches to news storytelling under stress, what streaming and digital news storytelling will look like in 2021, and a keynote interview with veteran news producer David Borman. If you haven't already, you should download our TV News Check events app from Socio, which features our agenda, speakers, and the ability for you to talk to each other and to our sponsors. And speaking of sponsors, News Tech Forum is possible because of them, and we want to thank them here. Avid is our title sponsor. Our premium sponsors are IBM, VizRT, and BitCentral. Delet, Brainstorm, and Blackbird are our gold sponsors, and additional sponsors are Planar, Newsnet, Shodaku, and Ross. Thanks to all of you for making these great and much needed industry discussions possible. Today, we've got 2 great panels for you, both moderated by TV News Check contributing editor Glenn Dixon. The first will tackle advances in IP and cloud workflows, and the second will look at remote production and the industry's great embrace of it this year. We've also got a fireside chat on cloud native editing and the future of news workflows. And when our regular sessions conclude at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will shift into an interactive roundtable discussion on embracing 24-hour news in local broadcasting, led by TV News Check's publisher and co-founder, Kathy Haley. I want to remind everyone that these sessions are live and we want your questions, but we want them in the right place so that we can see them. So please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and not using the chat where your questions will die a lonely death. So without any more preamble, let me welcome Glenn Dixon to introduce his panel on IP and the cloud. Glenn?
Good afternoon. Welcome to Advances in Cloud and IP Workflows. I'm Glenn Dixon. News operations have met the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic by relying heavily on new remote production techniques based on IP transport and cloud-based tools. That near-term success has led broadcasters to consider how much of their production workflows should shift to the cloud and IP networking on a permanent basis, just as some have already migrated their playout operations to these technologies. Today, we'll explore that question with a group of experts in the field. Joining me are Mike Kralik, VP of Technical Operations and Deputy CTO for Sinclair Broadcast Group, Conchetta Murata, Executive Director of Production Systems Technology and Support for ABC News, and Brian Olson, Sales Director, U.S. Group Stations for VizRT. For the audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible, so please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists, which we'll address towards the end of the session. I've covered several large virtual events in the past month, and I think 80% of the conversation at all of them was about the cloud. I'd like to start with our broadcasters. And Mike, to what extent are you using cloud-based services today, whether they're public cloud platforms or private data centers, in your broadcast operations? And have you moved any news production workflows to the cloud during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so with respect to just overall, we're, like you said a minute ago, we have moved some of our playout and automation to the cloud, most recently the emerging networks, Comet, Charge, and TBD. So we've had some good success with the cloud. With respect to production workflows, what's happening right now is really an investigation of what components of our production workflows make the most sense to move to cloud. And one of the things that I think we've looked at overall is that store, and I think we're going to get into this, but storage is really an area that I think we've proven out that if we can make it fit as part of the workflow, that cloud-based storage is really an area where the operational complexity, the reduction in operational complexity, lets us benefit from some of efficiency in the cloud. And I'd say the other area that we're really taking a hard look at right now is where media traverses the cloud for us, where we already have, potential areas that through, remote, remote capture, people in the field, things like that, that if the video is transported or transversing the cloud in the first place, what we'd like to do is take a look at how we can lighten the reliance on deploy, equipment or technology deployed at the television station, and take advantage of that traversal to make our production workflows, and say, just simpler. I think everything at Sinclair, at least my strategy so far with cloud, has been be flexible and make it simpler. Right? Let's ease the complexity of the technology. We tend to benefit from that, both in terms of operations complexity coming down and cost efficiency.
Okay, thanks. And Conchetta, please tell us about ABC's use of the cloud, particularly
Sure.
as it relates to news.
Yeah. The pandemic definitely accelerated our shift, although, after our parent company's announcement for a move in New York, we were already looking function by function, where can we innovate, where can we get some efficiencies by leveraging the cloud. So we were starting that work. Where we ended up focusing and pulling forward some of our roadmap was the pre and post production workflows. That has been the focus. As you know, the live workflows are more latency sensitive, and we have to figure some additional things out in that environment. So COVID forced us to evaluate our work strategy, and we ended up deploying more virtual desktops for our editing and graphics environments. So really, for us, it just accelerated the work and expanded our footprint for pre and post production.
Okay, thanks. And we'll talk more about some of the latency challenges with the cloud for live production a little bit later. Brian, what applications do you see VizRT's customers taking to the cloud, or at least testing today?
Well, initially, even pre-pandemic, we had customers that were taking asset management, up into the cloud. In many cases, it was hybrid on-prem and partial in cloud. We also had customers that were, wanted to take editing into the cloud, and we have many of those doing that now. Actually, a couple of the major editing systems support NDI IP workflow, so you can actually edit completely in the cloud, whether it's on-prem or public cloud, if you've got big enough pipes, and stream your video from your editing right out of the cloud. In many cases, they'll convert it back to SDI at the edit workstation, so they've got their scopes and their SDI monitors and all that. But the IP transport with NDI makes that pretty easy. Once we got into the pandemic, things changed dramatically. When nobody could get access to their stations, I think most went with the most common way of doing things, with VPNs and TeamViewer and other things, to get into their actual workstations on-prem. But we'd actually been working for several years on both virtualization of live production, and ultimately we'd been working probably for maybe at least a year before the pandemic on public cloud live production. So we were kind of ready for this, and we'd been going through POCs pre-pandemic with a number of large broadcasters and social media companies, and really once COVID hit, they were full throttle and went from POCs to actually implementing and putting stuff into play for various programs. So we've got multiple tier 1 broadcasters that are actually doing live production straight out of the various cloud platforms. I think all three actually. So I mean that really accelerated things dramatically for us. We can talk about some of the issues with upload and download from the cloud, but one thing that really facilitates working in the cloud is when you have to traverse multiple VMs. NDI is perfect for that. Unicast, so you don't have a problem with the cloud providers and spitting out data through too many ports. And so it works really well. As far as download goes, on the UI perspective, and this probably falls into maybe some of your latency discussions later, but we use Teradici to get the speed of the UI, and we not only have to get the UI back, we have to get multi-viewers back. And so basically if you hit a button on the switcher, it better change almost immediately, and you better see your video change. And we found that with the acceleration, at least with Teradici and a couple others, it's the response time's quite good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and monitoring is something we're going to discuss a little bit later too. It was funny. I covered the Devoncroft conference last week, and they were talking about all the different changes, in production workflows across the industry. And their analyst Josh Steinhauer said, well, how did all this just happen overnight? Did everyone just develop all this technology overnight, or did everyone just get that much smarter overnight, or was it just that people kind of gave up some of their hang-ups, some of their hesitation with these new technologies? From your perspective as a vendor, was it that change of quick in mindset on some of these proofs of concept that then people decided to go live with?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, it was excellent timing. we were really in the right place and had done a lot of the legwork. I mean, NDI's 5 years old now. We've been doing virtualized production, at least in POCs and testing, for over a year. So that was great. I think a lot of the reticence, especially among tier one broadcasters on using some of this technology and using NDI for IP, really went away quickly once they saw that, hey, this stuff just works, and we can't do things a traditional way. So probably accelerated our go to market with a lot of this technology by probably a couple years or a year and a half at least. So it was a terrible thing for the world, but at least with respect to moving the industry, which sometimes moves rather slowly, broadcasting does. We've moved quicker than any time in my career, I think, as far as pivoting to new technologies. I think it's going to be extremely healthy for the industry, frankly. Not everything is 100% mature, but it's early days, and things are just going to keep getting better, more robust, and have less latency going forward. It's just the right way to do things. Working in software, IP, on computers, and getting away from proprietary hardware and anything that forces you to be on-prem. So we may have more of these events in the future, and disaster recovery is always something to think about too for various things. We had a station that had their tower fall on their station in Lake Charles, and they really struggled to get back on the air. They did a good job of it, but if they could have pivoted to the cloud and fired up an instance for live production and then used their LiveView or TVU links to go straight to the cloud, they could have been on the air probably in less than an hour, probably minutes, versus trying to figure out ways to get back on the air again.
Thanks. So it sounds like VizRT is fairly far down the road in bringing their products to the cloud. But Mike, when you look at the industry overall, and I know you come at this from the IT and software perspective, coming into your role in Sinclair, you look at traditional broadcast vendors. How prepared do you think they are to deal with these new cloud production workflows? How do you see the development overall in the industry?
Well, I'm concerned. I think Brian's right that it comes down to the ability to do POCs, to be willing to test these things out, because I think what we've found is really the POCs become the opportunity for the vendor to start to really pressure test the software in the cloud. They become the forum. It takes the broadcast industry, it takes us basically to push on it a bit to get to the cloud in the first place. But what I'm concerned with is what they find when they get there. Right, when we start pushing towards the cloud and we say, we're going to run this POC. When we get there, a lot of times the assumptions, are incorrect, and I think it comes back to, and it, like I said, like you mentioned, my background in software development. I'm concerned because it takes a different architectural approach. I'm concerned because it takes a different development approach. I think that, the cloud, to me, it seems like, one of the main selling points for us, right, is the adaptability, the flexibility, and the speed with which we can operate in the cloud. We can adapt very quickly, but we can only adapt very quickly if the architecture allows us to adapt very quickly. And if the vendor is moving rapidly towards that scenario also, so that they can run daily deployments of their software. They can update on the fly. That they need to be as flexible and adaptable as we're willing to be in the cloud. And my concern is that there's a lot of legacy baked in there, right? There's a lot of experience, and legacy is not necessarily bad, because it also means there's a ton of experience with the uniqueness of our industry. However, the architecture is different. It is completely different. Whether that's networking, whether that's databases and message buses, these types of, the integrations become different. The ways we approach disaster recovery, resiliency, those types of things they're all different. And so I'm concerned that without our push, we wouldn't be seeing, they wouldn't necessarily see how much they're going to have to pivot internally to adapt to a cloud-based operating model like we are. It's a shared journey, right? We're moving there. I don't think there's any expectation that we won't get to cloud. It's just, I said it earlier, it's about the components. It's about moving the right ones at the right time. And it's about seeing which of those components can be moved, relatively easily and provide value quickly, and which of those are going to take more time, and making sure that the vendors and the consumers are aligned on those.
Okay, thanks. And just a follow up: have you have some of those issues that you mentioned with legacy vendors, has that pushed you to seek to work with new companies that didn't previously have a footprint in broadcast?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what it's doing, is to say, is it absolutely critical that I think I'd say there's an open question, right? The open question is, does the experience that our traditional partners bring outweigh the flexibility and speed of deployment that potential new entrants can provide? And I do think it's very much an open question at this point. I think it behooves everyone to take both paths, which it's a little bit, it's a lot more effort actually, but it is I think it's unresolved. We're still waiting to see, and some people will be, some vendors will be more quick to adapt, and some will not. and maybe that's where the split happens. Is it really comes down to which move which way.
Thanks. Conchetta, how would you assess the vendors and how ready are they for this shift to cloud with their products?
I think it really depends on the vendor. I also think, from a workflow and a function perspective, if something is more of a software-based system, that might be an easier transition. I think for some of the core broadcast functions, control room systems, et cetera, that are, linear and hardware-based, if the approach is lift and shift, it might not be as effective because, to Mike's point, there's architectural differences that need to be taken into account in order to solve these problems. So I also think, for pre and post production vendors, maybe this is a little bit further along. And again, to Mike's earlier point, as we're looking at the workflows, which ones translate well and which ones are going to take a little bit more time. And we may be looking for vendors that we wouldn't have looked at before because, the problems we're solving are a little bit different and we have new considerations. And so we can broaden our search. And then on a problem by problem basis, look at what makes the most sense today with the technology available to us and the roadmaps that those vendors are providing about kind of where they want to take their solutions.
Thanks. Brian, you talked about some of the work that VizRT has already done with the cloud, but can you just step back a little bit and just talk overall, like, has your development cycle changed now that you're creating applications that run in the cloud? Is the pace of product development a lot quicker? Are there a lot more iterations of it before you bring a product to a customer to trial? Can you just talk about that a little bit and how that's changed, versus, I know you've obviously your products have been heavily software based for a long time, but the cloud is another step on that journey.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we were we were doing some of this pre-pandemic, including graphics creation in the cloud. Maybe not necessarily play out from the cloud, but when you've got multiple artists in different locations, whether it be centralized graphics or just a large graphics team that's decentralized, working from the same pool of assets, in the cloud as you're building elements and creating finished graphics and finished packages is something that, we were helping our customers do pre-pandemic. But then the interesting thing that happened is, we started, a lot of our cloud live production work and really started to ramp up our cloud emphasis a little bit. But literally, once COVID hit, within a month, we sort of completely changed the emphasis of all of our R&D and product planning. And it was the biggest, fastest shift I've seen in any company that I've worked for in emphasis. And so we poured a lot of resources into moving more of our applications and our development focus into cloud-based development. But I think generally the nice thing about being a software company, and I want to emphasize that we are a software company, so we may not be a new player, but we're a player within the entire VizRT group that's been software based, including NewTek, and that has been doing software on computers for a long, long time. And so it's, when we actually had to do stuff in the cloud, we did some early steps with sort of on-prem virtualization where, frankly, you have to tune your VMs and make sure your networking is absolutely spot on and all that. And, our stuff worked, but we spent more of our time sort of tuning the infrastructure. And then literally, we had one of our technical pre-sales people say, I'm just going to put this in AWS. Like, okay. And it was just seamless. It's like, the cloud providers take care so much of making provisioning, the memory, the VMs, the networking, that we didn't have to do hardly anything. You have to pick the right level of service, obviously, but literally we put our live production software in the cloud and it just worked. And so as far as tuning our development to work in the cloud, it's like, or at least public cloud, it was a no-brainer. So it's actually been quite easy, and it's actually made our lives easier. Now the big thing we see from a commercial perspective is we talk to our customers about using public cloud, and they're still looking at price tags that don't make sense. I've talked to salespeople who work for the cloud providers, and it's like, I think they are willing to deal. Especially if you're a large broadcast group like Mike works for, you have incredible leverage with them. They don't want to lose business, so I think it's incumbent upon customers to really negotiate and get the deals they need from the cloud providers, because they can provide a ton of expertise that you don't have to have on the ground, especially at like local station level, as far as IT expertise. As long as you can get good connectivity to the cloud, they handle so much of it for you that it's, I think, a huge benefit to the industry. So it takes some of that need for that new type of person, the new type of expertise that we need in our business. It de-emphasizes it a little bit. I won't say it takes it away, but I think it's going to facilitate the transition, much faster if we can figure out the economics of the cloud and make it work for the industry.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because one of the discussions that I think we had for the prep calls for this panel or another one, someone made the point, well, the cloud is at a very high level, it's a form of outsourcing, right? And if along with outsourcing, some of your technology investment, you can also outsource some of that expertise, that instead of trying to find those very in-demand people to work at your station or your broadcast center to help manage this stuff, that does solve a problem for a lot of
There's one other pivot too, and that's the fact that it's OpEx, right? And our industry has been so capital intensive, and that's been the model. It's like you pay through the nose up front. It's sort of like accountants tell you when you buy a car, buy it and then run it into the ground. So you basically depreciate it for 5 years and look at it, go, well, that's still running. So you keep going. But I don't think that plays well into the new world. You want to keep your software current, obviously, for the latest developments and improvements. Computer hardware ages quickly, 5 years, and although there's a lot older out there, you don't want to go too much past 5 years. And so you've got these constant capital cycles that, you keep needing to finance. And it seems like as broadcast groups get larger and media, consolidates, you have these huge organizations with all these assets and hardware and software that need to be refreshed, and you can't get your capital going fast enough to keep things fresh before half your organization ages out and is on the cusp of going off the air. I think if from an accounting perspective, the industry just says, all right, we're just going to have to do this. We are going to pay more, cost of ownership over time probably is going to be more, but we're going to be able to keep our software fresh. We're going to be able to keep our organization on the same workflow much easier, and using things like public cloud, there's going to be sort of economies of sharing, multiple instances, whether it's time zone shifting. It's like, okay, the East Coast is done using these instances, they're available for the West Coast to use now, stuff like that. I mean, I think it's really going to require a bit of an accounting and business change to accommodate the technological changes that are coming.
Yeah, if I can comment on that real quick. I mean, I think you're exactly right, Brian. I mean, the concern here is, lift and shift, we know doesn't work from a cost perspective. There's not enough efficiency there. So we need to be able to componentize the system. We need to be able to, and what we're seeing is that when you use cloud-based architectures to really do containerized deployment of assets, it becomes about the optimization of those workflows, right? The spin up, the spin down cycles, making sure that things are sort of basically use case based, right? So as you go through and, you're only going to spin this up for the amount of time, you're only going to pay for it for this amount of time that you're using it. You're not making that long-term legacy investment. And what that means downstream is obviously that we get to a point where our business is more dynamic, right? We get to a point where we can now swap components in and out, be more dynamic in our application of services in that cloud-based production workflow or any distribution workflow, whatever the case may be. And as the business models change, which we've seen, right, a continuous change in business model and more rapid change in the business model means that we can't bake this thing for 15 years anymore. We now have to be able to plug and play a different service in for a different purpose at almost any point in time. That combined with an architecture that allows it in the first place is what will really kick. I mean, I think we're at the beginning of the end of the cloud piece, right? Mm-hmm. And but this is the next acceleration is when we see the architectures available so that we can be more dynamic in applying technology to the changing business models.
I think flexibility is the key word, really being able to flex, whether that's scale up, scale down, pivot, add on. I think it's that's key to media and entertainment's survival, I think, and being able to produce content, as much content as they need to produce cost effectively. We're actually launching some completely new business models in January. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the industry responds to it, but I think it's probably the direction that we're talking about, and we're anxious to have those conversations.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, as Mike was speaking, it made me think about the challenge with interoperability traditionally that we've seen with broadcast systems, and I think this makes it even more important. There are standards for things, but how those standards are implemented is going to matter a lot, because if we want that flexibility to kind of spin things up and spin things and implement new ways of doing things and new software, new systems, then those systems need to interoperate and integrate. And I think that has been a challenge previously. So
yeah, so here's you didn't ask for it, but here's my thoughts on that. Transparency of data, but amongst systems, right? So we've got these tools, we've got these architectures in the cloud that give us this ability to be more transparent about what is happening in our systems. And I think that's key, right? We have traditionally said either it's our data, like when I say like our data, like the systems data. It's the systems data, so it's input by some process in your business. You've got this information into the system, but it's the system's information to use. I think that needs to stop. I think the exfiltration of that data needs to become widespread. We need to provide transparency of data, and this is where we get talking about event message buses and service buses and things like that. We get to the point where I'm not requiring an API integration back to my system. I'm being verbose about what my system is doing, so that now that transparency of data enables the integration of systems on the fly. It becomes a dynamic system, and I just it's a pivot, like you said, Brian. It's a shift in how we think about our systems. They're no longer a closed system. It is something that has to be verbose, has to be transparent. Otherwise, honestly, we should kick it out. It shouldn't be there. We don't ever want our information locked into a system.
That's exactly right, Mike, because, as an automation vendor, having to integrate with every third-party product that's out there, the integration takes too long, and the speed with which we're moving right now won't accommodate that. So like being transparent, being verbose with all of your protocols and everything, I think that's probably the only answer. And, as much standardization as the industry will accept, but I don't even know if that's enough. I think, just like you said, just spit it all out there and let the various vendors deal with it on their own.
Thanks, guys. You both touched on this briefly, but I'd like to explore a little more in depth. Can we talk about you know, how you use storage for your production operations, storage in the cloud, and and what the financial considerations are of doing that, particularly for archiving. And I know, Mike, this was something you want to talk about, not just about across the Sinclair stations, but some of your other properties. But can you walk us through your thinking on that? And then I'd like to get Conchetta's point of view.
Sure. I mean, I think it's one of those that there's not a big, some of the concerns we brought up earlier, right? Big architecture changes, massive development, concerns with integration, these types of things. A lot of those are suppressed, I think, in a storage workflow. So it becomes a more realistic approach. It also is an area that that at least from a cost-effective perspective, it's pretty close. I mean, we've run a lot of analysis here, and the amount of operational efficiency it brings sort of tips it towards cloud storage being the way that we're going to go for definitively for anything that traverses the cloud, and for anything that's an archive type material. I think you'd be hard pressed to not consider cloud storage as your approach. I mean, the cloud vendors, no matter who it is, have gotten much better at hierarchical storage management, right? We can move the archive to match the importance of the archive is really, I guess, the best way of putting it. So putting it on the right type of storage in the cloud is really important, but none of that's difficult, right? This is low hanging fruit as far as I think Sinclair is concerned, that whether it's an RSN archive or whether it's a news archive, there are significant just benefits to being in the cloud.
And thanks. And Conchetta, what's your thought of using the cloud for storage
Sure.
versus other systems?
Well, I think it comes back to what is the use case, and then as I think about this, kind of where is the processing happening for what you want to put on the storage, right? So if you think about types of workflows we have, there's high-end production workflows. These are on-prem. They'll stay on-prem for a little while. General production storage, some transient storage, which I think, Mike, to your earlier point, is kind of low-hanging fruit. Archive and near-archive storage. So cloud plays a role in the future, definitely, but our specific use case isn't really there yet for cloud. Low bitrate proxy, sure, for browsing our archives, but high bitrate, financially, there's egress considerations, and really we need to dive into the workflows and understand kind of how much we're moving and when, and things like that. So, if your work in the processing part is happening on-prem, I think there's still some things to figure out for moving that type of content to the cloud. And so really this comes down to, what problem are we solving and what efficiencies are we gaining by putting it in the cloud? And that's going to kind of drive which workflows we move next.
And to that point, ABC recently invested in an LTO, a big LTO system, if I remember correctly, for archives. So
we recently implemented an asset management system, and again, most of it is in the cloud and the low bitrate proxy, but our high bitrate is still on-prem.
Thanks. Brian, any thoughts on how your customers are using the cloud for storage? Has that changed at all? Particularly when we talk about things like graphics.
Yeah, like I mentioned, doing putting your graphics creation process up in the cloud, so all of your assets, your creative assets, are up there and accessible from remote workers wherever they may be. And we've put our our MAM system, our asset management system, in the cloud. But usually it's some kind of hybrid scenario with some on-prem or at least cache. And then, so I think I think to Mike's point, it's kind of a no-brainer now. It's easy. You know, it's file based. It's like file transfer. Doesn't have to happen in real time. And you know, so I think it's something that, you know, my customers are doing now and have been doing probably for a while. I don't want to call it old news, but I think it's kind of a given now. And we're, you know, the stuff we're talking about further beyond that is where we are now, is how do we push beyond that and go take this to the next level. But, you know, as Conchetta says, it's the workflow's got to make sense, and you've got specific infrastructure already in place and people that understand certain workflows. And, you know, if we throw everything out and give them something now for something completely different, it's going to go off the air probably. But you know, I think it's really a process of migration at the proper pace. And you know, we're very interested in working with our customers, and really this is going to require a partnership. And Mike's talking about, you know, the POC is like, we can't battle test this stuff. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the use cases. And sort of like going to Mars, we're going to find some weird stuff when we get there, but we'll work through it together, you know. And there's going to have to be a lot of patience on both sides to get through it. But I think, you know, the end goal to me is almost as exciting as Mars, and that's the future of broadcast. And, you know, I've worked in the industry for, I won't say how long, but this is probably the most excited I've been about the industry, because we're moving so fast now in the right direction that it's getting fun again. And you know, I'm just glad to be part of it, and I hope we get there soon.
Okay, thanks. You know, we as I referenced at the top of the session, there's broadcasters who've been using the cloud for playout for years. You know, maybe it's for cable networks, maybe it's for DigiNets. ABC was pretty early on playing some of their cable networks out of private cloud. Sinclair's done a couple different things with playout from the cloud, and, you know, what Mike referred to before, they switched their DigiNets to playing out. And you know, historically, everyone said that is relatively straightforward, but using the cloud for live production, particularly sports and news, is more challenging because of latency issues. And it's not like there isn't any latency in news production today. You know, what Mike was referencing, content that's traversing the cloud. You know, he was referring to, you know, these IP backpack systems. If you're bringing in bonded cellular feeds, there's some latency. And I think every viewer, whether they realize it or not, you know, they see that every day in talkbacks, right, between anchors and reporters in the field, and people have figured out how to accommodate that. But when you look at moving the whole workflow, you know, for a newscast to the cloud, how much of an issue do you still see latency being today? Maybe I'll let Conchetta take the first whack at that.
Sure. It's definitely a challenge. Some workflows are just more, you know, in live or not in live, are more tolerant of the latency issues. And I just think everything is a trade-off. And we look workflow by workflow. And, you know, from an IT perspective, we can architect around some of those challenges. But, you know, at this point, we haven't for live workflows. So, you know, I just think it's going to continue to be a challenge. We'll have to see.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, how do you see, how much of a stumbling block does latency present when you look at using the cloud for production, either at the Sinclair stations or at the, you know, the sports properties or Tennis Channel?
I think it's a big concern. There's some things that we can do, right? We can, it relies on obviously more technology, but I'm thinking about, more embedded signaling. I'm thinking about bringing the production people to the infrastructure. So closing the gap between, so sort of a remote, remote working versus working inside of the environment. So where the architecture is, where the servers are actually deployed in the cloud. If you bring the user interfaces to there, that solves some of the problems. If you look more closely at where you embed your signaling, into your workflows, that can close some of the gaps. There's things like that that will, and even how your metadata is transported alongside some of your production workflows. All of those start to allow us to close some of those gaps. I'm not saying that we don't have significant hurdles. We do. I mean, latency is still going to be an issue for a while. But I think, look, we're learning it still, right? It's still the reason why we're doing these POCs, because we continue to learn ways around it. We have some fantastic technologists in Sinclair working on these problems on a regular basis. We're still trying to solve, the issues and taking a look at it. And it just it takes brain power and it takes time.
Okay, thanks. Brian, you mentioned this briefly before. What are some of the networking technologies customers are using today to try to address that latency problem? And maybe you can talk about some of the pros and cons of the choices out there.
So, I mean, if we're talking about upload to the cloud, there's like a lot of possibilities right now. It's actually quite easy. There's SRT, there's SRT iPhone apps. So you can basically, go right from your phone or your tablet, right up to the cloud for live production. We've, in addition to Skype, in our software, we've added support for about another half dozen video conferencing services. So basically you can dial into the switcher, from whatever your, Zoom or whatever your favorite, video conferencing service is. So that makes, remote guests, live shots, I mean, even anchors in their homes, super easy. As far as latency goes, it's probably a little more issue for talent if you have a confidence monitor or something, because you're obviously going to have the whole round trip, As far as the people doing the production, unless you're in the same room or next to the talent, the only latency that matters is, from the time you see the video to when you make something happen, does it happen? In our case, we're talking X number of milliseconds, so it's extremely usable. And if you think about our entire air chain right now, there's tons of latency in it, until the times it gets to the viewer. And when it's streaming, even more. So I think we got to look at latency where it matters. And I think, obviously you can't have latency when you're trying to do live production. You've got to, from the time you see it and hear it, do things to it, and then it goes off somewhere else. And it may take a little while for it to get there, and it may take a little longer to get where it's going, but at least in your little bubble, it's not latent. And I think we're pretty close to that right now. But ultimately, we're trying to find better ways to traverse the public internet. NDI doesn't do it right now, but that's something we're working on, would like to have happen. So you could basically go make the whole round trip. Right now, in a lot of our workflows, we'd be going from NDI to SRT up to the cloud, back to NDI in the cloud, SRT back down to on-prem if you need to, or you can obviously just stream right out of the cloud. But we're trying to make it streamlined and as easy as possible for transport, because until we get transport easy and latency easy, or low rather, the whole concept of doing live production in the cloud won't catch on fully. And I think ultimately, that's where we're going to go, at least for part of the workflow.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for just one more question. And it's funny, a couple of years ago, the big technology question we were talking about was whether news operations that have HD SDI gear, whether they should switch and go to IP networking, go to SMPTE 2110 infrastructure for their routing and do production that way. And there are certainly some big networks who have done that. But Mike, when you look across the Sinclair stations, and I know your boss Del Parks has talked about the number of stations that have very viable investments in HD SDI gear for local news production. Do you think now about, is there a reason to make that move to 2110, or is there the possibility of just by the time those systems are aging, just switching to the cloud just taking those production operations to the cloud, and and I guess maybe talk about some of the financial implications of that move.
Sure. Real quick, you don't think I'm going to say something different than Dell, do you? No.
No,
really.
no. You talk about
No,
leasing.
no. I mean, to be. I mean, no. All joking aside, the sports properties, I think 2110 makes a lot of sense. I think especially as you're looking at the high bit rate, uncompressed, video. I think as you're looking at 4K and other, more, UHD type content. I think 2110 probably makes a lot of sense for a while, but it depends on the speed of development in the cloud. And then on the news broadcast side, Dell's right. I mean, we've got a lot of investments in HDSDI that don't necessarily provide, or where 2110 wouldn't necessarily provide an additional piece of value, right? All of this it's cost value, right? And for each component in the equation, it's cost and value. For news, maybe that cost value equation is not right. For sports properties, it could be. But then that depends on what the cost value relationship for cloud becomes over the next year, 2, 3 years, whatever the case may be. And I'll leave it at that based on time. I know we're over.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else can chat anything brief to add to that?
No, I agree with that. I think it's, cost value and, just where is the technology and what is the workflow?
I agree
Fair
with
enough.
Mike.
Well said. Everyone's being very considerate of time, which is helpful to me as moderator. Well, hey, I'd like to thank everybody. We've come to the end of our time as referenced. I'd like to thank everybody for their insights and thank the audience for their attention, and hope you enjoy the next session.